Welcome everyone. We'll just wait a couple of minutes while people are still being let in, and then we'll start. And could I ask everyone to mute their microphones, because the sound quality improves dramatically when people are muted. Of course not if the speaker is muted, but apart from that. Yeah. Well, let us begin. Welcome to everyone to this Agrarian Change Seminar. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS, University of London, and I will be chairing this session, in which Professor Tania Li will present her work on corporations and development, lessons from Indonesia's plantation zone. I'm also joined by two organizers, Sreya Sinha from University of Cambridge and Enrique Castagnon here from SOAS. The Agrarian Change Seminar series is organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. This year, the seminars are, for very obvious reasons, run as webinars, and that has certainly some additional qualities to it, including that we can have speakers from across the globe without having to fly them in, and that makes it a lot easier to reach speakers we otherwise would find it harder to do. You can find the full program of this series on our website, Agrarian Questions, which has the URL aqs.org.uk. The webinar is also being live streamed on YouTube. Before we start, here are some guidelines for participants. As I already have said, please keep your microphones off, except when you're contributing to the discussion. Secondly, we hope that the webinar will be quite interactive, so you can write questions and comments in the chat at any point in time. This is also the case for those of you that have joined us through our YouTube live stream. There's a chat function there too. In addition to that, in the question and answer session that follows the presentation, those in the webinar can also ask live questions. Simply use the raised hand function. You will find this function if you click on the participant button and look around a bit. If you can't find it, just wave your hand and I can probably spot that too, with a bit of luck. Of course, when asking a question or making a comment, please be considerate and respectful. Finally, we're going to record both the audio and the video of the sessions. So if you do not wish to be recorded, simply don't use your audio and video. Okay, it is now time to welcome today's speaker, Professor Tania Li from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. As a world-leading scholar, Tania doesn't need much by way of introduction. So let me simply highlight a few. Her prize-winning book, Land's End, Capitalist Relations on an Indigenous Frontier from 2014, broke new grounds as it tracked the emergence of capitalist relations among indigenous highlanders in Sulawesi in Indonesia, and investigated what that meant for concerns about community and indigeneity as the new class relations developed. Other publications include the book Powers of Exclusion, Land Dilemmas in Southeast Asia, co-written with Derek Hall and Philip Hirsch in 2011, and the book The Will to Improve Governmentality, Development and the Practice of Politics from 2007. Tania has also published numerous articles on land, development, community, class, indigeneity, food sovereignty, and surplus populations, with a particular focus on Indonesia. Her forthcoming book, Plantation Life, which is co-authored with Pujo Semedi from the Gadjah Mada University of Yogyakarta, examines everyday life under the shadow of Indonesia's massively expanding oil palm plantations. Okay, with no further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Tania today to present on the topic corporations and development lessons from Indonesia's plantation zone. And Tania, you will speak for 45 to 50 minutes. Over to you.
So thank you to Jens and the organizers, to SOAS, the organizers of the Agrarian Change lecture series. This is a famous series. I'm very thrilled to be invited to speak in it. I've not done this before. Thanks to the attendees giving up an hour or so of your time to participate in this discussion and listen to me. I hope you'll find something useful. If you're like me, I'm now getting invitations, from around the world to listen to seminars that I would never normally attend. And it's quite exciting, but of course also overwhelming, and too much Zoom can be problematic. I'm especially appreciative of friends in Indonesia who've joined this talk, even though for them it is midnight, because they're on a different time zone entirely. So thank you for giving some time to this. I hope you won't be too disappointed. So I'd like to recognize that this research that I'm going to present today was undertaken in collaboration with my colleague and fellow anthropologist, Pujo Semedi of Gadjah Mada University. Hang on, I'm just changing the view here. He is here in the audience, which is very odd, since I'm presenting the analysis that we developed together through joint fieldwork and hundreds of hours, I would say, of discussion and co-writing over a period of many years. The fruits of that work will be reflected in our jointly authored book, which will come out next year from Duke University Press. We'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of around 100 of our students from the two universities, University of Toronto and Gadjah Mada, who participated in the research. So this is very much a collaborative effort. So what I don't plan to do here is to summarize, our entire book, which I think would be too much and also too superficial. But instead, I want to give a brief overview of the research context and the argument we're making, and then tease out just one thread of the analysis, that question of the connection between corporations and promises of development, and try to give it some texture, some ethnographic density. So the project that Pujo and I embarked on a decade ago was to provide what we thought of as a grounded ethnographic account of the forms of life that emerge in Indonesia's oil palm plantation zone. This zone now covers around 15 million hectares and involves around 15 million people in living the plantation life that we are trying to explore. One stimulus for our research was a sense that a decade of important research on the global land rush had drawn the attention of scholars and activists and policymakers to the beginning of a story, the arrival of corporations that lay claim to vast swaths of rural land. And what we learned from those studies was a whole lot about what was lost when corporations arrived: loss of diverse ecologies and livelihoods, loss of customary land rights, the erosion of customary institutions. But these studies did not tell us much about the social and political and economic relations that emerged after these corporations arrived and were installed. So that then was what we attempted to do with our research. And Indonesia is obviously a good place for this because Indonesia, which is the site of our research, has more than a century of experience with corporate land concessions, which began around 1870 and are still expanding, notably since 2000, where they've been really stimulated by the global market for palm oil. So palm oil is part of the story, and it's part of the reason why the story of plantations in Indonesia is not a story of the past, but absolutely one of the present and the future. Palm oil then, which in case you don't know too much about it, is derived by crushing palm fruit. It's a cheap and versatile vegetable oil, which is found in half of the products in Euro-American supermarkets. It's found in all kinds of processed foods, junk foods, ice cream, also in cosmetics and detergents, and it can be used as a biofuel. Indonesia produces half of the global supply, and Malaysia, its neighbor, produces another 35%. So these two countries together produce 85% of the global supply. A much, much smaller portion is grown in Latin America and in Africa, which is, of course, the continent from which the crop originates. So what happens to this oil? Well, from Indonesia's production, about 60% of it is actually exported to India, where it is popular as an affordable cooking oil. So, you know, this is a South-South movement of products, and the emergence of a market in India of people who can afford to, you know, consume fried goods, the bhajis we all love to consume, you know, is one of the key markets for this crop at the moment. Palm oil, just to put it in a national context, is Indonesia's most important export by dollar value. So this is really a big deal. Indonesia's palm oil is produced mainly by large corporations, both domestic and transnational, about half-half. So there are transnationals involved. There's also a lot of Indonesian capital in Indonesian-owned corporations, many of them private, not listed on public exchanges. Smallholders also grow the crop, sometimes independently, but more often in outgrow arrangements that tie them to corporations through various relations of dependency and debt, which we examine in the book, but I won't discuss today. The site for our ethnographic research was a dense plantation zone in West Kalimantan, one of Indonesia's islands. And I want to pause here just to show you some pictures to give you a sense of the milieu. I'm going to try to do this, share a screen. Okay. So this is the format in which oil is consumed in India and elsewhere, basically cheap cooking oil. This is a classic plantation picture, you know, regular landscape, straight roads.
Tania, sorry,
Tania.
I think
It's not working?
the photo isn't visible. I think you're not.
Okay.
Have you shared the screen?
Try it again.
Yeah, just try.
It worked before the presentation. We can attest that.
Okay, I'm on screen too. You're just still seeing me?
We see you.
Right. Are you seeing it now?
No.
No.
Okay, try again.
Yes,
Now?
it's
Okay.
coming slowly. Yes, it's there.
All right, so apologies. So this is affordable cooking oil as it consumed in India. Classic plantation view, you know, linear roads, monocrop on a vast scale. This picture is oil palm, which has been injected with herbicide to kill it so that the new generation of palms can be planted underneath. So it's very much an industrial landscape in which one generation replaces another. This is a picture of the mill where the oil seeds are crushed at the first stage of processing, which must be done within 48 hours of harvesting the palm. This is a plantation worker's house. The emphasis on the neat and tidy, the white picket fence. These sites, as I will explain, are understood to be sites of exemplary modernity in an otherwise backward countryside. I'll come back to this. This is part of that exemplary modernity. This is a wedding being staged in one of the plantation housing enclaves, you know, shiny and modern, a little bit Disney, I would say. This is a view from that plantation across the river on a site which will figure a lot in my story, which is called an enclave. But basically, this was the original hamlet. You can see that the palms come right down to the hamlet. So it's enclaved by the palms. It's a tiny remnant settlement with no farmland at all. And this is, in fact, the fate of a great many people who lived in this area before the palms arrived. This is just to give you a spatial view. This is the province we're working in, West Kalimantan. And the colored areas represent plantation concessions. So the red is already licensed, but the green areas have already been allocated to corporate control. So it really is a massive land use, really covering most of the arable land, potentially arable land in the province. And this is a map from 10 years ago. We weren't able to get a more current map, but you can assume it's very much denser now. This is a map of our actual research area. And what you can see, the white area that's the river. The colored blocks are different plantation concessions. 5 private companies and a state company are in this area. The white areas along the river are those little enclaves, like tiny residual hamlets and residential areas. The white at the bottom of the picture is our upriver hilly areas, which are forest concessions and not available. So basically it's a saturated landscape in which plantations have taken up really all of the available space. One of the characteristics, I don't know how well you can see it, but these little tiny black dots inside the plantations are these enclaves. So they're tiny little dots, but they tell a big story because those are the places where the former population is still living within and around plantations in tiny residual hamlets without any land. Okay, this is a shot from the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, taking visitors who actually in this narrative are both white and speak with a Spanish accent. So this must be assumed to be a group of visitors from perhaps Peru or Colombia, one of the countries where oil palm is being installed, who are being taken on a visit to see the neat rows of palms and the happy and prosperous people. Okay, so that's just to give you a quick sense of the kind of landscape that I'm talking about. So now into the argument. What then is a corporation, and what is the relationship between corporations and development? For those of us schooled in political economy who love to hate corporations, it takes actually some effort to recall the benevolent role that corporations are expected to play in securing the public good. We, critics that we are, can dismiss ideas of the public good as so much bad faith, since we think we know that the goal is really profit. But the mandate which is given to corporations to occupy vast areas of land depends crucially on their discursive legitimation. In this case, the narrative that plantations create prosperity and bring development to remote areas. Some history is useful here. Corporations were recognized entities under ancient Roman and Indian laws with rights to own property, make contracts, and to govern the conduct of their members. Since at least the 1700s, corporations have been given legal and sometimes royal mandates to do things like build water systems and railways, run cities and universities, launch trading empires, organize the settlement of colonies, and to set up plantations. In all of these activities, it's recognized that profit is legitimate reward for achieving a public good, with the nature of that good variably defined. You know, setting up railways was understood to be profitable, but it was also something that the nation required and for which the sovereign or the government gave corporations concessions. So in order to achieve then these, one could think of as the dual mandate, profit and the public good, corporations are granted privileges, monopolies, permitted to privatize public resources like land and forests and waters and so on. Laws favor corporations and grant them access to subsidized land, often subsidized credit, also bailouts. We see many of these today, and other forms of what we sometimes think of as corporate welfare that absolve them, in fact, from the capitalist imperative to operate efficiently or to be competitive in market terms. So although one might think of them as the kind of leading edge of capitalism, it's a particular form of capitalism backed by subsidies, monopolies, and in fact absolved of the responsibility that small-scale farmers, like the folks I described in Land's End, have to actually sink or swim on the basis of market competition. Corporations are also licensed to produce harms, what we call in the book licensed harms, and to select which components of the population and which species may be sacrificed in order for a public good to be achieved. Building on the work of the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, Joshua Barkan is a geographer working on this, who wrote a very brilliant book called Corporate Sovereignty. He calls this the paradox of the sovereign ban, in which legal exceptions and the abandonment of populations are justified is vital to the security of political communities. So somehow, because of the good that corporations are supposed to do, they are in fact permitted to cause harm and to make a selection of who shall be saved, who shall benefit, and who in fact shall be sacrificed. So bringing this now to Indonesia, Indonesia's laws make the public purpose of Sorry, is that okay? I'm hearing some feedback. Indonesia's laws make the public purpose of delegating the state's production and development mandate to plantation corporations quite explicit. The 2014 plantation law, for example, states that, quote, "The land and water and natural wealth in Indonesia is a gift from God to be used for the maximum prosperity and well-being of the people. Plantation corporations have the potential and capacity to achieve people's prosperity and well-being in a just and fair way." So that's the preamble to the plantation law, which permits then plantations to monopolize 15 million hectares of land, and so on. The investment law reads in a very similar way. Since the 1990s, Indonesia has pursued an unapologetically neoliberal development strategy focused on foreign direct investment and corporate-led growth. There are currently, if you see the news, street protests in Indonesia against a proposed bill to create jobs, as it's called, which will drastically overhaul land, labor, investment, and environmental laws, all with the goal of easing foreign investment. The World Bank has supported this direction with the argument that people need proper jobs to replace the low-value work that they currently do in agriculture and the informal sector. So in this version of development, the people's economy, in short, is not to be upgraded, their agriculture, their informal sector jobs, but in fact replaced with corporate formats, of which plantations are an obvious and enormous example. Despite Indonesia's scandalous inequality, it's the third most unequal country in the world after Russia and Thailand, where 4 men own more wealth than 100 million people. The neoliberal narrative of trickle-down growth is seldom questioned in Indonesia, and most Indonesians assume that corporate plantations serve a public purpose framed in these terms. Remarkably, in our view, the narrative that plantations bring prosperity and development to remote regions is repeated endlessly, but neither the plantation law nor any other law imposes any legal obligation upon corporations to ensure that the people's prosperity is actually achieved. So the law grants them concessions on the basis of this promise, but does not oblige them to make good on this promise in any concrete way. Nor, it turns out, do proponents of this narrative find it necessary to provide any proof of this relation. So although we have searched, we have found no numbers to demonstrate that people in plantation zones are becoming better off or have improved access to healthcare or education or other facilities. The idea that prosperity follows from corporate presence is simply to be taken on faith. There's an interesting contrast here, just as a digression, with mining. A study by Marina Welke on transnational mining corporation Newmont in eastern Indonesia found that that corporation hired armies of social impact researchers who actually were scouring neighboring villages to somehow come up with data to demonstrate the beneficial impacts of corporate presence, looking for things like improved life expectancy or reduced malnutrition or improved school attendance. They actually felt obliged to try to demonstrate that there was a benefit. But in the orbit of the plantation world, no one has tried to do this, and there is no evidence. So what we found then in our research in Kalimantan's plantation zone was that corporations do indeed produce prosperity for some people. They provide facilities for selected workers and villagers to lead exemplary modern lives. Recall the white picket fence in that picture, together with the TV antenna, signs of prosperity and well-being in Indonesia's rural terms. They also, though, produce destitution when they eject former landholders and abandon old and injured workers without means of livelihood. And they treat this abandonment as normal, as a licensed harm, if indeed they acknowledge the harm at all. How then can this be? So to kind of explain this, this is where we try to dig in ethnographically and try to figure out, like, how can this actually be done? That you sustain a promise of prosperity and development while producing harm and destitution, and yet somehow you're never called out for it. So we start our ethnograph. I'll start this ethnographic account with an observation about the acute social divide that corporate presence inscribes in the population between those who were favored and those who were abandoned. So if you think about the pictures I just showed, on the one hand, the folks in the house with the white picket fence, and on the other hand, the people across the river in that tiny little hamlet perched on the river's edge with no land. In the context of nominally equal citizenship in an independent nation, how can such a divide become, on the one hand, entrenched, and on the other hand, normalized, actually creating two very different types of rural person? So Pujo and I argue that contemporary plantations, of course, are not inventing this divide. It's been embedded in the corporate mandate and inherited intact from colonial times. It is, in Anne Stoller's words, what she calls imperial debris which is embedded in the land law and in agricultural policy that dates from colonial times and that remains effective in the present. So it's the rot, what she calls the rot that remains. It's debris from the past which is embedded in present structures and in fact replicated. It's also an iteration of what Cedric Robinson calls racial capitalism in its particular Southeast Asian version, which was memorably caricatured by Syed Hussein Alatas as, quote, the myth of the lazy native. So this myth maintains that natives on the spot have not done anything useful with their land. Hence corporations and their imported, usually migrant workers, are licensed to take over the land and turn it to productive use. So this we know as a colonial narrative, but how is it replicated today? So what we find is that corporations embody their claim to superior efficiency, their claim to know how to do agriculture in a modern way, in their orderly rows of crops, those straight lines of palms and roads, the mill, the machinery, and also in their social and spatial arrangements. So they make plantation cores with their office blocks, their housing blocks, their white picket fences into exemplary sites of modernity in which selected worker families are enabled to live exemplary modern lives. So this claim to superior efficiency, prosperity, and development is actually enacted and embodied at the site of plantations in the format of the crops, the housing blocks, the office blocks, and the mill. As an everyday social arrangement, what we found is that as an everyday social relation, this arrangement means that plantation workers, who are mostly migrants to the area of Kalimantan, come to see themselves as utterly different from and superior to the surrounding population. So Indonesians do not call this relation racial, but the difference, we argue, is race-like in that it's an embodied and effective sense of superiority, sometimes expressed in ethnic stereotypes, and for sure instantiated in extreme social distance. So some plantations that we came to know who had lived in the plantation zone for 30 years had never traveled upriver into surrounding Malay and Dayak hamlets. They saw no need for it. There was nothing of interest or value to be found there, while mixing with backward and unruly people they thought could be dangerous, could be risky. Minimally, it would be awkward, and they could not see the point. So that's this sort of entrenchment of a social divide is one part of the installed social relations. From the corporate perspective, the spatial arrangement of a plantation and its legal mandate enabled managers to, in fact, overlook the surrounding population as if they simply were not there. And that, again, is something remarkable. Like I showed in that map, on the one hand, the blocks which represent corporate land concessions, and inside them, those little tiny dots, which are the remnant hamlets. Even spatially, they're represented as tiny, right? If you didn't know what they were, that was where people live. In fact, the people who were the former landholders, you would overlook them completely. And legally, they are overlooked because plantation corporations are legally responsible only for the workers within. They have no mandate for and no responsibility towards former villagers who were living outside their borders or in what are called enclaves, which are kind of legally excised from the concession. Nor do they have any responsibility for former workers after they retire or become injured, after they lose their jobs, nor do they have any responsibility for casual workers who were recruited from nearby, who have no right to pensions or healthcare or any other protections under the labor law. So this is one of the neoliberal laws that Indonesia has passed in the last decade, which gives extremely limited protection to casual and outsourced workers. So these ejected and abandoned people, with all their losses and their suffering, are legally speaking ordinary villagers. Their fate is the responsibility of the national and village government, and corporations have no responsibility at all towards these people. To put this in a comparative perspective, in colonial times, it was the inside of plantations that raised the concern of critics. Critics worried about these plantations as enclosed zones of exception set aside for slavery, indenture, and abuse. Today, in contrast, we would argue that the inside is the site of relative privilege. The problem is the plantations ruined and abandoned outside. It's all of those other people and places that are set outside corporate responsibility. So our study gave us some close-up glimpses of life in these enclaves, as they're called, a life without land, with polluted water, few jobs, and very limited infrastructure. School, healthcare, roads, etc. were quite abysmal. In that picture that we showed, the poverty was visually striking. Rotten wooden houses, muddy paths, an almost derelict mosque. A district requirement for corporations to return 5% of their profits to the district under corporate social responsibility requirements is simply not enforced. It's not done at all. Even if it was, I would argue, it hardly makes up for the livelihoods lost. So after 30 years of plantation presence on their land, many of the villages in the surrounding areas had nothing at all. And those who had retained tiny plots of land found it radically insufficient for the needs of coming generations. So this is one of the tricks. Those enclaves may initially leave, not just, they don't evict, right? You can't evict all the people all of the time, and eviction causes a rumpus. So you enclave, you draw a circle around a hamlet, leave the people where they are, and maybe leave them with a little bit of their old rubber trees, a little bit of land, which for one generation might keep them somewhat pacified. But of course, with the passage of time, the injection of those palms, the reproduction of a new generation of industrial agriculture, and an increasing population, destitution is going to follow. Villagers in this situation described their position, I think quite tellingly, as, quote, becoming the audience. They could see the prosperity, the decent houses, the water, the electricity, basically the full set of facilities provided for workers inside the plantation boundaries, this kind of modernity package, which was there kind of tantalizingly on display, but they themselves had no way at all to access it. In the words of one villager from one of these enclaves, who we call Ibu Marlina, she said, "My mother was a widow, we were 5 children. She was raising us by tapping rubber, and we grew our own rice and vegetables. Our family's rubber garden was right there by the bridge. Then the village head took the land. We used to have something of our own, even though it wasn't much. Now this all belongs to the company. We just have to take orders from them and hope that they give us work." So a perspective from the enclave. So digging further into this, were these villagers in fact ordinary citizens who could make demands on the state? Like, if the company is not responsible for them, well, then the government must be. And that's certainly what the corporations say. Well, you know, it's not up to us. These are ordinary Indonesians. They're not our workers. We have a legal concession to the land that we're using. They're simply not our responsibility. They are, it's their own local government who should take care of them. So this is where we found a sort of a rather unexpected, well, perhaps because we were naive, but I mean, an unexpected dimension of the kind of political relations that corporate presence installs. These people are not actually ordinary villagers for the following reason. Government officials in a plantation region, from the district to the sub-district to the village and the hamlet level, are all officially assigned to what are called coordination teams, where they are paid by the corporations to facilitate the work of the corporation and, you know, supposedly to make a bridge with the local population. So these people are tasked, and why is this done? Well, because of the corporate mandate, because the corporations are not there illegally, they are there legally. And in fact, on state invitation, they have a government mandate. They've been invited in, enabled, facilitated in order to take up land and make their contribution to development. So these, the entire local government apparatus is embedded in, or you could say in bed with, the corporation. They cannot stand outside it to act as mediators or brokers or defenders of the local population vis-a-vis the corporation, because they themselves have been incorporated inside the corporate apparatus. So this isn't just the whole matter of kind of bribes and extra payments. This is the official structure in which they are appointed as members of coordination teams to assist the corporation. What this means then is they can't be neutral brokers. They take the side of corporations and protect them, especially from exposure to villagers' protests and claims. So appointing public officials to side with corporations would be problematic enough. In Indonesia, however, it's an arrangement that's especially damaging because of the way that citizenship works. So in an Indonesian, as Pujo and I kind of thought about this, like, what does citizenship actually look like in Indonesia? And there's some very good work on this done by scholars, some on everyday citizenship. So the rights of nominally equal citizens are stated in law and in the constitution. So it's not as if Indonesian citizens do not have a set of legal rights, but the capacity of ordinary people to claim those rights depends on the mediation of local officials and politicians, big people who are expected to connect ordinary people to sites of authority. Citizenship, in short, is dual. It's both a legal status and a profoundly hierarchical relationship in which ordinary people cannot defend themselves from the actions of powerful people. And to claim their legal rights, they must turn to these same powerful people for intercession and support. So this is why the positioning of local officials as collaborators of the corporation is so catastrophic in this case, because you can't just go to the law or go to the labor office or go to the land office or go to the court and lodge a complaint. you can't actually even approach those sites of authority without the mediation of the village headman or the district, sub-district official who would write you a letter of support enabling you to go and approach such people, right? The whole system basically relies upon the role of mediators who have now been reappointed as collaborators of the corporation. So corporations as, quote, partners of development that bring prosperity to the people look deeply problematic then from the perspective of our research. Beneficiaries are selected, so are the victims, who are not just left out, but economically, politically, and socially undermined, rendered different, characterized as deficient, abandoned, and overlooked. And the concept of public-private partnerships that sounds so benign looks downright dangerous. It's also misleading because corporations are intrinsically both private and public. They are both sources of private profit and they are extensions of state power with a public role to fulfill. In Foucault's terms, they are, we could think of them as political technologies. They are deployed to meet public purposes, such as the management of territories and populations, the generation of foreign exchange, the development of remote regions. They're tasked with many of what one might think of as kind of governing functions on behalf of the state. The most useful way that Pujo and I have found to theorize this dimension of corporate presence is by thinking of it as a form of occupation. Corporations occupy not just concession lands, like clearly there's a spatial element to their occupation, but they also occupy the surrounding territory in a way that makes the status of, quote, ordinary villages ambiguous. Legally, citizenship in these outside spaces is unchanged, but in practice, it's degraded as officials and local leaders are appointed as collaborators of the occupying force. Plus, every dimension of life in these enclaves, access to land, work, water, pollution, pests, everything is shaped by the corporation. So they're both occupied and excluded or abandoned or set aside. And some of the writing on forms of occupation in Palestine actually kind of recognize this spatial unevenness of occupation in which not all spaces are occupied in quite the same way. Different segments of the population are occupied differently. Nevertheless, the whole area really is subject to occupation. Villages in the study sites that we were in the study area that we came to know are placed in a kind of David and Goliath situation, but they have no means of actually making any claims on this Goliath because from the perspective of the Goliath and from the perspective of the law, it has no responsibility for them. So I want to end or move now to take a brief look at advocacy agendas and the promises of what's called sustainable palm oil, which offer the hope of reforming corporations and ensuring outcomes that are win-win. Like, we're not the first people to recognize there's a problem with corporate plantations. The question is, nevertheless, they are expanding, so how is this happening? So what we found when we took a look at these campaigns is that they make a division between bad corporations and good ones. This is one of the ways in which these sustainability narratives actually support corporate presence. So the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, for example, ran a campaign under the title Good Oil, Bad Oil that acknowledged bad palm oil upfront. According to the campaign website, the production of bad palm oil is rapidly destroying virgin rainforests and ecosystems, causing greenhouse gas emissions to rise and putting many species at risk of extinction. If grown sustainably, good palm oil can benefit local communities with fair working conditions, while also helping protect our invaluable species and forests. So it's a campaign strategy that acknowledges the harm upfront, but claims that only bad palm oil causes such harms, whereas good palm oil is exempt. Animated short films featured on the RSPO campaign website show popular consumer items like cookies and ice cream that contain palm oil and ask the viewer, is it good or bad palm oil? And the animation answers the question by filling a box with a check mark or a cross. So it's a campaign which invites, which not only conjures the possibility of a good corporation and good oil, but involves the consumer in discerning and distinguishing between the good and the bad in order to ensure that the good proliferates and the bad does not. A campaign by the Rainforest Action Network under the banner Conflict Palm Oil, so it's taken the language used for conflict diamonds and so on, to the same effect, to divide the world into bad or conflict oil and good oil, which it calls responsible oil. Similarly, corporate commitments to the no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation platform known as NDPE conjures a world in which bad actions can be avoided while benevolent ones become the norm. Under these standards, what does no exploitation mean under these standards? What it means is no child or bonded labor, but other workers can be employed without exploitation. So no exploitation means no egregious worker, no egregious violations of human rights in terms of bonding and child labor, but it doesn't mean that all workers will reap the full, from a Marxist perspective, I guess you could say the full value of their labor. According to this platform, primary forest and peatland cannot be cleared because that's no deforestation, no peat. But clearing villages' rubber groves does not count as deforestation because they are not classified as forests, and so on. Indonesia's sustainable palm oil certification scheme, it's developed its own national scheme, and it sets the standard for certification very low. Basically, corporations must obey the law, but since land and labor law favor corporations, not too much can be expected. The point to stress about these campaigns to certify sustainable, virtuous, and conflict-free oil palm is that they focus their efforts on reform, making efforts to make bad oil and bad corporations good. They focus on harm reduction, on the protection of high conservation value forests, and on clear violations of human rights. But they do not address what we are thinking of as the licensed harms, the routine abandonment, the entrenchment of social divides, or the erosion of citizenship that our study uncovered. What one could think of as the slow violence that's entrenched by corporate presence in rural spaces. Nor do they question the necessity for corporations to dominate in the production of palm oil. So that's another element. Most crops that were once grown on plantations globally, coffee, tea, rubber, sugar, are now grown mainly by smallholders because smallholder production turns out to be more efficient. So in an agrarian studies seminar, this is a very familiar argument. It turns out that the same is true for oil palm. Family farmers can produce as much oil per hectare as plantations. There's no technical economy of scale. The technologies used on the large plantations are very low tech, and it's identical to what smallholders use. Of course, smallholders also produce at significantly lower cost because they have no need for managers, clerks, foremen, guards, and that whole apparatus of surveillance which a large-scale plantation requires. As it turns out, Indonesian farmers, like farmers elsewhere, are not in fact lazy natives, but capable and willing to grow global market crops alongside food and other crops, as they've done successfully for at least 3 centuries. But the problem is that recognizing farmer capacities would undermine the colonial premise that legitimates corporate presence. This is the premise that plantations are necessary because villages cannot grow these crops efficiently, nor can they develop their communities or generate prosperity on their own. Right? That narrative is absolutely crucial to the legitimation of corporate presence. Let me quote a district head speaking at a ceremony to open a new plantation in a district adjacent to the one where we did our research. According to this head, quote, "The government can build some infrastructure, but to develop the people's economy, investment and the private sector is needed. We can't hire everyone as government officials, military, or police. That is why the government has opened its doors as wide as possible to the private sector. So according to this district head's narrative, development of the people's economy is the task of corporations, which are in fact licensed to destroy the people's economy. In this case, 8,000 hectares of village rubber groves and rice fields, which were bulldozed to make way for this plantation, and which had the effect of closing off farming futures for the current and certainly for future generations, including the option to grow oil palm, which villagers in Kalimantan are very eager to do because it's a highly lucrative crop. Note also that in his narrative, development is equated with the provision of salaried jobs like those of government officials, military, and police. So what this does then is it radically discounts the value of smallholder livelihoods and discounts the social value of the farming values who pursue these livelihoods, even when they make good money, as these people did from their rubber trees. And in the campaign against this plantation, village spokesmen, basically were at pains to show that they had achieved both modernity and prosperity on their own. As they said, we have motorbikes, our children attend the local high schools, we have a good life here. They were rejecting the idea that a corporation, the presence of a corporation was necessary to fulfill this idea of development and prosperity because they already had these things. But that whole, okay, let's go, because I'm on the last bit. As Pooja and I have shown then with our research and many others confirm, both sides of the corporate development narrative are false. Many plantation corporations do not produce efficiently, and they would fail if not for their legal privileges, subsidies, monopolies, and bailouts. They do bring prosperity, but very selectively alongside ruin. In contrast, smallholders can produce efficiently and generate prosperity quite effectively on their own, so long as they have access to infrastructure and markets. So why then does the tide of plantation expansion continue unchecked? So Pooja and I argue that it's not agronomy or efficiency that dictate corporate dominance in Indonesia's rural spaces. It is, quite obviously, politics. On the one hand, political economy, corporate profit, corporations make out like bandits. It's a very profitable crop. Secondly, political technology, the way that governments grant concessions to corporations to occupy territory and undertake government functions. And in Indonesia, also a third kind of politics, what we think of as the impunity that characterizes Indonesia's political milieu. There's a lot more that can be said on this topic of impunity, but the part that I've elaborated in this lecture is the contingent character of citizenship, rights and the law, which require the intercession of people in power. So that's one form of impunity, a regime in which rights and the law are contingent upon intercession. And of course, they are doubly contingent when people in power are officially appointed as collaborators of the corporation. More to be said about corporate occupation, imperial debris, and the residues of racial rule, which I'll leave for another talk and another day. So that's enough for now, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tania. There was a lot there, which is a pleasure, which is great. There's lots to think about and lots to discuss, of course, as well. So thanks a lot. So we're now opening for questions, both written questions in the chat here on the YouTube live chat, and as said before, people can ask live questions if they raise their hands. And then they can ask their questions. Just to kick off, just a couple of points here from me while people gather their thoughts. So just where you ended, more or less, the idea of that the argument that the agrarian transition in Indonesia based on plantation is a political choice. Not that doesn't relate to productivity per se. It relates to those that have power can decide the the path of agrarian change. I thought that was hugely interesting, and it's just a comment to flag that up. I thought that was powerful, and I did read your recent 2 years old paper where you looked at generational change of laborers outside plantations, and how exactly it was the absence of access to the absence of ability to have their palm oil processed within X number of hours that meant that they couldn't grow what they wanted to. So yes, it is. So I think that argument that is hugely important and interesting. But my question is slightly different. If we go back a few steps into your argument, if I understand you correctly, then you are saying that workers in the plantations, while they work there, have reasonable conditions. I couldn't quite, I didn't quite get whether those workers, when they retire, when they fall ill, also have good conditions, or whether they then join the outsiders, the informalized labor that may work a bit but have no rights. So it'd be nice just to have clarified whether the inside outside is how much that those that are inside have rights along the lines of formal workers elsewhere in the world, or whether it is even worse. And to me, that links to the idea that some people have pushed of neoliberal citizenship, where it is only those that work that have citizen rights. If you're not working and if you're not formalized, you have no citizen rights. And I wonder what you think of that, whether it's useful to think of it in those terms, or whether there are other ways of thinking about it. And slightly linked to that, the outside workers with no citizen rights, the outside villagers with no citizen rights, are they local people, or are they migrants to the areas over the last generations? And does that matter at all? Are there difference in rights also in how local, how embedded you are in the general Kalimantan society, or is it simply everyone that are outside plantations have no rights? Sorry, that was a lot, but just to start off while other people then start thinking. Please, over to you.
Thank you. So what we found, and I actually have written another paper on this in Comparative Studies in Society and History, a bit more on the labor question, but briefly, workers in the state plantation, which is one of the two we studied, which was formed under the new order, actually had quite exemplary worker conditions. They were treated more or less like civil servants, government employees, and they had a full panoply of formal labor rights, including healthcare and pensions. What has happened over time is that since there's been a change in the Indonesian labor law since 2004, encouraging and enabling the outsourcing and casualization of workers. So even in the state plantation, for the formally employed workers, conditions are still good, but their number has dwindled. They have been, those plantations have casualized, and the private plantation that we studied always had a much more flexible labor regime. It is still the case that the formally employed workers do fall under the labor law and do have rights to something like the district minimum wage, an annual increase, an annual bonus, etc. Of the whole of the Indonesian workforce, last time I looked at it, something like only 4% fall under formal labor law. It's rather like India. It's like the formal is the exception and the informal is massively the norm. For a while, this was not true in the plantation sector, which was one of those sort of isolated islands of formal sector employment. But it is now the case because plantations have massively casualized and outsourced. Even for the formal sector workers with pensions, their pensions are pretty small. So they too face extreme insecurity after they retire. So is it the case that only people who work in the formal sector have citizenship rights? That's a bit extreme. Only people who work in the formal sector have formal labor rights. But citizenship rights has to do with this question of how you can approach the state apparatus. You know, what can be done to you with what kinds of impunity, and what's your means of recourse, right? And that's something villages in the local area, I mean, workers in the state plantation also felt they had no recourse, although they were protected by formal labor law. When the state plantation was going into bankruptcy, as it did after our research, we asked them, well, why have you considered going to the district labor office to lodge a complaint that your wages have not been paid for 6 months, that your bonuses have been withheld? And they said, well, we couldn't really do that because we do not know those people, right? They felt that they needed an intermediary. They also assumed that people in the district labor office, like everyone else in the bureaucracy, would side with the plantation, and that they, as small people, could not lodge a complaint against a powerful corporation and its allies. So for that, even people with formal rights, the corporation and its assumed alliance with the entire regional government apparatus made that they too, even the most legally enfranchised group, still felt that they could make no claim. And for people who were casual workers, they're not even protected under the law, let alone, you know, the capacity to go and complain. People in the local area in these enclaves are mainly locals. They're the original indigenous Dayak and Malay population, but there are also some former plantation workers, especially actually from a colonial era plantation, which existed on the same site, from which some workers married into the local population. This is one difference that we found. The colonial era plantation was actually bizarrely, socially less segregated. Because it was kind of off on a frontier in Kalimantan, and the workers did not see themselves as superior, and the locals did not see them as superior. They thought they were pitiful people who, you know, had to work very hard at someone else's behest, and were these workers, as soon as possible, actually took off and joined the local Malay and Dayak families, married into them, acquired land, and became locals. So the local population is somewhat heterogeneous, but it's definitely dominated by the local Malay and Dayak people. But that's what's sort of interesting here, right? These are people whose customary institutions have been completely undermined because their customary leaders have been brought in as collaborators of the corporations. So they don't have an intact customary system to defend them. That entire system has been absorbed by the corporate presence. And this is the case in all the plantation areas. Even if the customary community initially rejects the arrival of a corporation, sooner or later, most are fractured, and collaborators are found and created, and a similar structure of kind of local fragmentation in which leaders, charismatic leaders, customary leaders, village chiefs, all become what is called locally company men, orang perusahaan, you know, people who side with the company in some kind of collaborator role. It's very difficult to maintain an outside.
Thank you. Let us. I could continue asking, but that will have to be another day. So chieftaincy and capitalist agriculture, of course, there's some interesting parallels there, but maybe to other parts of the world. But well, for now, I have 3 people on the waiting list for actually asking questions, and there are a fair few questions on YouTube plus one in the chat here. I'll take the 3 live people first, and then we will go to YouTube afterwards, and then to the chat here. Angus McNally, please.
Hello, everybody. Firstly, thanks, Tania. I thought that was a brilliant talk. Really, really interesting. I have two questions. Firstly, you mentioned that the corporation in the mining sector had no respect compared to the respect that corporations had in the plantation sector. And I wondered why there was the difference. Why did the mining corporation have to justify itself and its presence, whereas in the plantation sector, this was taken as a given? I don't know enough about the history of extractivism within Indonesia, but I would imagine that both are colonial activities, albeit with a different kind of development pathway. But I wondered whether you could speak more about this distinction between like mining companies and the plantation. Secondly, I work on Latin America, and I know that particularly with soybean extraction, that you do have smallholder farmers who sharecrop their land, or they lend their land to big corporations, because the big corporations are linked into transnational circuits of capital that can kind of sell and produce soybeans. And you mentioned in your talk that palm oil is in half of the goods that we find in the supermarkets. So I wondered what's the role in corporations in linking the production of palm oil to on the ground to the industrial kind of like production within food, and whether the political economy of the production of food plays a part in your tale about where corporations fit in. So I wondered whether you could speak about the role of the corporation in bridging the gap between local production and the political economy globally of food, particularly junk food, processed food, etc. Thank you.
Great. Tania?
Okay, great. So maybe my mining example was too brief because I'm not sure it came across very clearly. So this is a study by Marina Welker of Newmont's mine in eastern Indonesia. And as a transnational corporation with a lot of reputational risk and global exposure, they were very attentive to social impacts. Right? They didn't want to be found guilty of causing. I mean, they knew they know, of course, that they produce harms, but they also wanted to, especially environmental harms, but they wanted to be able to demonstrate that they did produce development benefits. So they had their specialists, their social impact researchers, continually monitoring what was going on in surrounding villages in order to show that villages were improving in their livelihoods and their health, and that they in fact were doing better than villages in other regions further from the mine. So that was partly because it's a transnational corporation in the global spotlight that they were making these efforts. That's probably a good thing, right? You're going to have a mining corporation, you would far rather have one that is exposed in these ways and is making those efforts than one that isn't. In the plantation sector, first of all, its spatial dynamics are very different. Newmont mine, massive as it is, only occupies 600 hectares. These plantations occupy tens of thousands of hectares in contiguous blocks. So clearly their social and spatial footprint is very different, and the number of people affected by them is 12 million hectares as opposed to 600, right? I mean, it's a lot of people, a lot of corporations, hundreds of corporations, half of which are Indonesian owned and not publicly listed. So they do not have this kind of reputational risk. They don't feel under the same spotlight to demonstrate public benefit, and no one in the government system or holds them accountable for this, and there is no legal requirement, right? So that's the difference, that an isolated transnational mining corporation has to watch its image. Hundreds of Indonesian and transnational corporations occupying millions of hectares are not being monitored in the same way, and either by the government or by anyone else. So that's really the key difference. So in terms of the kind of the larger kind of corporate story, initially Pujo and I were under the mistaken impression that the main kind of value added in palm oil is further up the chain, right? It's to do with the refining and the processing and the kind of entry into the global market. But it actually turns out, as we learned from reading the kind of business reports, that the major value added, like the big bucks, are actually at the plantation end. It's very lucrative to produce this oil. So that's why these corporations want to have plantations. If not, it would be far more convenient for them, one assumes, to leave the production of the oil, the growing of the palms, to villagers, buy the oil from them and make their value gains further up the value chain, right, through the processing, the marketing, and the food manufacturing. But in fact, the big net returns are at the plantation side. It's in the fields. So that was sort of interesting for us when we realized that. It sort of made more sense of why plantation corporations would do this really difficult thing of acquiring land, managing cantankerous villages, causing all this conflict, why they would bother to do that. But the reason is that it's actually very lucrative at the production end. But with all of these other crops, the question of whether smallholders can enter the same global markets, as it stands now, they can, right? I mean, a smallholder can grow this crop. They have to have access to a mill, and that's the tricky part, because it has to be milled within 48 hours. But then it moves down the value chain, gets further refined. There's no reason why farmers can't have access to that supply chain so long as they have access to a mill. Then they're kind of in the system. That's obviously what they seek. So in places, in some areas, in some few parts of Sumatra, certainly in Thailand, which are less subject to large corporate dominance, they have small-scale mills, suitable for 500 hectares rather than 50,000 hectares. Vastly different scale, and that that there are ways of doing this whole thing in a far more decentralized way than installing this type of monopoly over massive areas of land and enormous mills, which then are, greedily seeking access to fruit and are in a monopolistic relationship in regard to smallholders, but also want to have their own plantations, because once you've built a huge mill, you need to feed the mill. So you want to have the plantation to make sure that the supply of fruit is constant. And that's really what the business literature shows, that there's a kind of a scalar problem here, which could be avoided. Smaller mills, more decentralized production, all of it is perfectly possible, and you would still have your junk food at the same price.
That is an important point. Now I think we will have to move on to having a couple of questioners putting up questions forward at the time, just to get through them all. So Helena Perez-Nino, and then Jaisal and Raj.
Yeah, very simply, and with the purpose of being a bit provocative, I noticed that you mentioned conflicts between the migrant workers and the dispossessed population, and you've couched them, or you've chosen to couch them in terms of a quasi-racial or racialized conflicts. And I also noticed that you referred to the corporation and very insistently avoid references to capital. So I was wondering if I can perhaps pinch you a bit around this reticence to use what I think could be, usefully deployed categories of, in this case, class conflicts and conflicts between different agrarian classes. So that would be my first question. And I don't think we'll have much time for more questions. So let me leave it at that.
Excellent. And we'll go straight on to Jaisal and Raj, and then ask Tania to.
Yeah. Thank you so much for an interesting talk. My question is also related to racial capitalism in a way, but from a very different anthropological perspective. because if I listened correctly, you have mentioned like the migrant workers, the plantation workers look down upon the native population, maybe the smallholders. But then I hope to listen more in terms of racial capitalism, because you were talking about social citizenship also. Because I think it's safer to assume that in many other contexts in the plantation zones, I'm specifically thinking about Tamil migrant workers in different parts of the world, South Africa, and even Gurkhas of northeastern India, and where I work in Kerala and all. Stigmatization and looking down upon these migrant workers is a way to legitimize landlessness of these workers. So my question is, what is the sort of social profile of these corporations? What is this social identity of these government officials? And how they actually, I'm just thinking about the categories of identity, categorical relations locally that, for example, Felipe Burgos talked about in a Latin American context. And also, I'm just wondering about possibilities of resistance, like their own unions, smallholders unions. So what's happening there in bypassing the, let's say, the government officials or the village headman in fighting these corporations? Thank you.
Could I just come in here? I've received a question which is I'm wondering about the characterization of the principal actors in your study. On the one hand, the corporations are quite active actors interacting with an apparently active state in shaping lives in the quest for profits. On the other hand, workers come across as being passive. They're acted upon but do not act. Is this how you wanted to characterize the dynamics between corporation and workers? And that is, I think I can say that is from Haroon.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the question of class and different agrarian classes, it's these kinds of formations are complex, right? Because the people who work for the plantation corporations are themselves workers, they're paid employees. They tend, within the plantations, obviously there is a hierarchy, managers, people in managerial and technical positions see themselves as superior to, ordinary workers and field workers. These are somewhat differentiated ethnically, although it's not, like in Philip Bourgois' study, this was kind of a rigid ethnic division. In this case, it's more a preponderance. Managers are more often Batak. Very few field workers are Batak. You find Javanese as managers and as workers, etc. So it's a more differentiated kind of ethnic map employed within the plantations. But the question of whether they look down on the locals, like I said, this is actually, historically specific, because in the colonial plantation in the same site, that was not the case. Like in that particular historical era, these were Javanese contract workers who were regarded as sorry folk, people who had been, who had nothing in Java, who'd ended up indebted and contracted by a corporation. Locals, I wouldn't say looked down on them, but they certainly felt sorry for them, and so on. So I think these are, the relationships are actually historically very specific. Who is recruited on what basis, who does what kinds of work. And so I think the useful thing to do here is to kind of recognize that labor is involved in all of these conjunctures, all of these kinds of assemblages. There's going to be land, labor, and capital, but exactly who will be the workers, how they are arranged, whether locals are recruited or not, whether certain tasks are ethnicized and certainly gendered, is also part of the picture here. So in the Indonesian case, all of these workers in the current moment are nationals, right? So it's different from the situation in Sri Lanka with the situation of the Tamil workers. These are all national citizens, and it's extremely different from Malaysia, next door country, producing the identical crop, in which most of the plantation workers are Indonesian. So in Malaysia, they are migrant workers who do not have technical citizenship, right? They're not Malaysians. In Indonesia, they have technical citizenship. They're all Indonesians and they're nominally equal citizens, but in fact, they're organized quite differently in relation to the land, in relation to capital, and in relation to kind of local government. So, what we see then is these very heterogeneous sets of relations in different contexts with different consequences. And one thing that Pooja and I have been pretty careful about in the book is to argue that to understand globally circulating capital, it's not, you have to recognize that wherever capital kind of touches down, it's going to be in a specific place, a space with its own history. It's going to involve a cast of characters, a sets of workers with their own history. And, these kinds of assemblages of capital, labor and land are always specific. There is no such thing as kind of generic global capital. It's always going to be an assemblage of these elements, but in very different configurations at different times and places. And there's no kind of shortcut to actually investigating their specificity, and you wouldn't want to kind of generalize from one. So, I mean, the question of class, like I said, it's complex within a corporation because, there are kind of, one could say there are classes within. In the terms of a sense of class, though, what we found, and this comes back to the question of what people do about these things, we found that the segregation, and, Philip Bourgois talks about this as well. I mean, the ethnic segregation, the gendered segregation, between different worker groups and between the inside and the outside was actually pretty catastrophic. So in the case of a plantation with the private plantation, like the resident workforce was migrant, male, and lived in plantation housing. All of the maintenance workers were female, local, Malay and Dayak, and the two groups worked for the same corporation, and they had absolutely no communication. They didn't see each other, they didn't know each other, and they certainly had no unions or capacity for. Sorry.
Always something.
I don't know how to put it off though. It will stop eventually, I suppose. So that's they weren't. So what kinds of actions did they take? There's I didn't have time to go into it, but part of the impunity in the Indonesian case has to do with a very violent history of suppression of union activism in 1965, in which the massacre of hundreds of thousands of plantation workers and farmers union members took place, and the union movement has not recovered. So to this day, there are no strong autonomous unions representing either farmers or workers in Indonesia. There are small unions. People bravely, valiantly try to regroup, but it's against the grain. And in Sumatra, where the repression was most severe, ethnographic studies, one wonderful study by an Australian undergrad who he spent 6 months with a kind of nascent union. I mean, it's a heartbreaking story of kind of brave efforts to unionize and quite disgraceful levels of intimidation and repression that followed. So unions are not available to them. So what then do people do? What we found, and it's not a heroic story, is that both villagers and workers basically help themselves. So the plantation system is riddled with theft, theft of fruit, theft of time, theft of machinery, basically, and I think this can be directly linked to the lack of union forms of organization. It's like as if there is no articulation of a collective struggle or any means to make progress collectively or to join across these groups, connect the struggle of villagers and workers and so on, what happens instead is people take what they can, get what they can out of a bad situation. Mobilizations, there are wildcat strikes, not in the state, but in the private plantation. There are blockades, there are, people do take action, but it tends to be ad hoc, and it's basically paid off. The managers call in the leaders of a blockade, offer a small settlement, Panadol as they call it. You give people some Panadol to make the headache go away, cool the temperature, but the underlying disease is not addressed, right? And Marina Welke found the same expression used in the mine she studied. You offer Panadol, but you don't address any underlying issues. So it's not passive, but the forms of action are not, for the most part, collective, and they're not heroic, and they're not transformative. They're more to do with making the best of a bad situation, or sometimes making the best of a situation which has a lot of opportunities, because there's massive amount of wealth flow in and around a plantation, and everyone's goal is to get their hand on a little piece of it, or a big piece if possible.
Interesting. No, very interesting. Let us go straight on to the YouTube streaming now and hear questions from there. I think Enrique, you have monitored that. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Well, thank you, Tania, for the presentation. People on the YouTube are also grateful for that. Actually, there's a small debate already there, so that's great. I have selected 3 questions from the chat. The first one comes from Eco Footprint, a nickname, obviously. He or she asked whether the presence of oil palm plantations can be seen as means for the state to consolidate its control over the territory. So that's one. The second one comes from Francis. He would like you to expand a little on the reasons why companies prefer to import workers rather than including locals. And similarly, Gillian asked if you could say something more about those migrants, who those people are. And finally, Yosara asked if the binding treaty of human rights and corporations that is currently being discussed might help to alleviate the sort of negative impacts on local people.
Sorry, could you just repeat the last one?
Yeah, the last one is, I understand that there's a binding treaty of human rights and corporations currently being discussed, I suppose, in Indonesia. And she or he asks whether that might help to alleviate some of the negative impacts, if you think that this treaty of human rights and
rights attention.
Yes.
Now, before you answer, maybe we'll have to also just go to Shreya. Shreya, I'm sorry to spring this on you, but I think you have also received questions via the chat, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. I think there are quite a few questions, and I mean, a lot of people have said that they really enjoyed the presentation. So I'm just going to, Adwa is asking what is the nature of land tenure in Malaysia in the affected landscape, and how does that influence the process of enclosure or the role of the state? Marcella is asking, Tania, did you look at the influence of finance and banking for the involvement of smallholder farmers for engaging with palm oil chain? And as you described for the cocoa plantations at Land's End, what is the general land and customary rights situation in Kalimantan for those involved in oil plantations? What is land and how land is assembled in the situation? There are a couple of questions around, what consumer consciousness can do and what NGOs and charity movements can do in this context. Rory Wood is asking, Tania, in your opinion, what incentives, if any, are there for the government or the companies to change their behavior in a way that would positively affect the local people? If there is no incentive for the government or the companies, did you gauge a desire for change from the locally affected people themselves? Survi Nayak is asking, are there any moments of solidarities and possibilities of mobilization? I think you touched upon this a little bit just now. And also with the availability of limited land, how are the present generation belonging to previous land owning households reproducing themselves? And just one final question, which is from Christine. In which part of Kalimantan were you, and are people they're concerned about the environmental aspects of large-scale plantations and what effects can they feel. Thank you.
Thanks. And Tania, please, if you can pick some of those questions and talk to them, that'll be fantastic.
Okay, and or just respond really briefly. Sorry, I do tend to go on, I know that. So is it about state control over territory? That's interesting for us because, you know, if you read, you know, Nancy Peluso and Peter van der Geest on territorialization, you know, you'd think that state had an interest in kind of expanding state territorial control and using plantations as a vehicle for that. What you actually find is that what's produced on the ground is a kind of a chaos because the government does not have maps, doesn't actually know where all the plantations are. Many of them are not legal, they're not registered. So it's not as if the you know, arrival of plantations has neatly organized everybody in their place. There's actually, the stakes are very high, and for every legal plantation, let's say of 10,000 hectares, it turns out that another couple of thousand hectares around it have been privately appropriated, usually by government officials and plantation officials in unregistered plantations. So it's not actually control over territory, as in, you know, everybody neatly in their place, but it is certainly a vehicle for what we call in the book, you know, collection of rent, right? Because every one of those both legal and illegal plantations is paying someone in order to be there, whether legally through licenses and fees or sort of under the table for looking the other way. So it's basically a major feast for government officials, which does not come down to control. And in fact, transparency is the last thing you want, or the last thing the government officials want, because too much transparency and legibility, in Jim Scott's terms, would be much less lucrative than this kind of gray zone which currently exists. So that's on that. The question of why they prefer to import workers, I think this is an old story. You know, colonial plantations certainly preferred to import migrant workers. Now, it turns out that even within Indonesia, when it's a national plantation, you still want to import workers from other islands or other places. It is to do with the kind of myth of the lazy native in the sense that the workers on the spot are either in conflict with the plantation because it took their land, and therefore just sort of hostile, or if they are able to maintain some land of their own, they are not dedicated workers. You know, they show up and then their own rice field needs to be harvested, or granny dies and there's a funeral, and, you know, basically things happen to the people on the spot which make them less disciplined and regimented than an imported labor force that is going to get up at 6 for roll call and, you know, has no other distractions. So for various reasons of kind of labor control, an imported population, even if they're just imported from the district next door, is considered favorable or, you know, better, but it's gendered because the local women are not considered lazy natives, and they are employed in these casual and outsourced capacities. It's really only the men who are, so you have male migrant harvesters for the time-sensitive harvesting tasks almost always come from elsewhere. But women doing their fertilizing and spraying the pesticides, etc., they are local. So again, it's, you know, it's quite specific, you know, who is the ideal worker for what task. Human rights, does it help? I mean, there's a ton of reports written now on like human rights in oil palm plantations. And I mean, from my point of view, it's just never enough, in the sense that the focus of human rights studies is on the egregious stuff, you know, child workers, bonded workers, pesticide poisonings, those kinds of things, which are kind of egregious violations. And of course, they need to be addressed. But they don't get at what we're calling the kind of the everyday violence or the slow violence of basically being occupied by a corporation. And so that's an element which a human rights framework does not capture as well. You know, the life of an ordinary worker or a villager. You know, maybe that villager, you know, the land was taken by the plantation 20, 30 years ago. Human rights claim is not, as currently constituted, going to help them to get it back. Basically those kinds of framings end up narrowing to the egregious. And I understand why NGOs use these kinds of rights-based framings for their global campaigns, because they are charismatic, right? It's like, the orangutan is charismatic, the child worker, the bonded worker. These are, egregious and obvious problems that lots of people can agree to say no to. The more complex question of, do plantation workers need jobs, and should one not encourage corporate plantations so there are more jobs? To answer that, you need a more complex understanding of what kinds of livelihoods do people have before. What were they doing before they needed such jobs, right? And what are their options? You have to explain a whole lot more to explain the kind of the slow violence element.
I think I have to stop you there for now, because then we can take the last three hands and put them into the mix. And that is Alessandra Mezzadri, Judith Heyer, whose hand has gone down now, but if she's still here. And it says Boshan Adnan, but I wonder if that is Shapan Adnan. So let us start with Alessandra.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed this thoroughly. And my question relates to your very provocative comparison with occupation, in fact, which I think very few people picked up, but it's actually quite a statement to make, and one which I like very much. But in a sense, I'm trying to link it also to your past remarks on surplus populations. And I do wonder if what you're getting at is that these people, they're surrounded, occupied by the corporation, are left to die, as indeed one can say it's the case for Palestine, for instance, or if they still perform some functions. Because even in the imageries you gave us, at the very least, looking traditional, close to modernity, especially in development narratives, as a function in and on itself. So in a sense, I wonder if we can talk about commodification without rewards, or if they're really left to die as you would expect under an occupation. Thank you.
So let us just see if Judith is here, or it looks as if she has left the call. So Judith, if you're here, just start. Failing that, we will go to what is listed here as Boshan Adnan.
I don't think she's here, Jens.
No,
I think she's,
no.
yeah.
So Boshan Adnan. Which might be, as I say, it might
no,
be.
Shapan, you're on mute.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, the confusion in the name is because I couldn't use my own laptop and I'm using my son's. But my question is really about the nature of labor payment arrangements and the status of labor. And Tania, you mentioned two categories, if I remember, one of formally employed workers and another of those who were progressively casualized with much lesser rights. The question I have to ask is based on my experience with a similar industrial landscape, but of course with very different historical specificity. And these are from the state-controlled rubber plantations in the Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh. Now, the workers tapping rubber were not treated as wage workers. They were kind of treated as vendors in this neoliberal sense, so that they surrendered their produce to the corporation. The corporation measured whatever they were due to get. In addition, the officials charged them for bribes to be paid for the land on which they stayed, promising them some kind of land rights in the future. Now, the combination of that meant that the workers never got full payment, and there were endless complaints that they were actually being exploited by the system. Now, my question to you is, with the different kinds of workers in the plantations that you mentioned, do you have such arrangements, any comparable arrangements of them being treated as self-employed vendors providing produce rather than, being paid as through output sharing or piece rate arrangements rather than wage rate arrangements, and also exploited for the land occupation rights to occupy land.
Thanks, Tania. I think we will continue till 5. What in the UK is 7:05, so 10 minutes more, and that is your time.
Okay, great. So last one first because it's fresh. Piece rate, yes, definitely. Many workers are on piece rate systems. Bonuses, some of them extremely elaborate. I described some of them in my paper in comparative studies. Some of these piece rate arrangements are very fierce, but it's not. They're not treated as autonomous vendors. It's more like piece rate wage work. And the way in which the extra extraction takes place, and this is something that Pujo found in a tea plantation he studied in Java, including in colonial times, is by the routine capture of a portion of the wage by the foreman. So foremen, underweighing a product, taking the difference, or literally taking a 10% cut on the pay package, all kinds of ways in which workers are not getting even their paltry official pay through various kinds of extraction, but not quite the ones that you described. On the question of the kind of the functionality of the surplus, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, you could look at it on two ways. You could say that for the people who were in the formal employees who look at these desolate and destitute villages, you could say, if you were being really cynical, that the demonstration effect shows them how superior they are. It confirms their own superiority because look at the way these people live. They have failed to progress. The surprising thing and the sad thing is it does not connect to their own prosperity. They don't say, these people are destitute because we are here and because the plantation is here and because they no longer have any land, right? So that connection, which you would hope would link the destitution of some to the prosperity of others and create a kind of a solidarity, is not what we found empirically to be the case. What it did, its function, if you like, was to confirm for the formal workers their superiority and to confirm for them the backwardness of the villagers. Now, of course, the villagers didn't see it the same way at all. From their perspective, their impoverishment was a direct result of the corporate presence. And it was pretty obvious to them that these two things were connected. So there was no sort of parallel, in the function. But from another point of view, you could say, this can't be good for corporations. Anyone who visits and sees the destitution in the villages would have to say, what have you guys done here? You've been here for 30 years, promising progress. And look at how these people are living. It's disgraceful. They don't even have a primary school. It isn't a good picture. But the weird thing is that no one is calling them out for that. No one is saying, look, you've been here for 30 years. What have you done for these people? And they'll say, well, we haven't done anything because it's not our job. We are here to grow palm oil, and look at our workers. They have nice houses and they have electricity and all their children are shiny and clean and they go off to school, right? Which is true for the workers. So, there's a kind of a multiple disconnects there, which turn out to be really significant in the way this landscape is read and justified and made sense of by different participants in this kind of drama. So, the question that was asked about solidarity, unfortunately, does come down to that, right? I mean, we did not see signs of solidarity across these divides. The question of what I like this question of what incentive would the government or the corporations have to change their behavior? And I would have to say we couldn't find any. It's like it's very hard to see. And that was why for us, this narrative of the good and the bad corporation, on the one hand, there's the kind of the an outsider's aspiration, a sort of a regulator's aspiration to make corporations good, and a recognition that some are bad, but the tools are kind of, educative and persuasive. Most Indonesian palm oil is not certified, and they can sell it to India and to China and to other places where certification is not demanded. So, there's very little consumer-based incentive. The big campaigns have been in the EU, and Indonesia is very sensitive to this. They call it the black campaign, an evil campaign. They also attribute colonial motives to it and argue that once again, the rich countries are trying to protect their own oils, olive oil, canola, etc. And by criticizing a poor country that's trying to create jobs and prosperity for its people, right? So, they push back against campaigns questioning the integrity of palm oil, arguing that in itself is a neo-colonial conspiracy. So it's a complex territory for sure, and I don't think it can happen on a consumer basis. And the political and economic incentives for the status quo are enormous. When we looked at the profit margins, we actually, one section of our book, we asked, can corporations fail? Is it possible for the bottom to fall out so that it would no longer be profitable for these corporations? Could there be ecological collapse? Could there be financial collapse? And ecologically, possibly, but some of these plantations are now on third generation of palm. They've injected herbicides and replanted 3 times in the same spot so far without collapse. I mean, certainly with increasing biochemical inputs, but on chemical life support, these palms just keep growing. So there's that, so far, the historical lesson of the dangers of monocropping have not yet kind of entered. Not true in Latin America, right, where the palms are actually doing rather poorly, and some of the pest and disease profiles are proving really challenging in that environment. And it may mean that it never becomes such a big industry in Latin America because of these sort of ecological reasons. From the point of view of market collapse, June Burrows and others, they've written about, the problem of the flex crop, right? A crop which can be eaten, which can be a biofuel, which can be used in hundreds of different products, and which is so much cheaper than any other oil on the market. It's not impossible that it could have a market collapse, but it would have a really long way to go before it became unprofitable for corporations. So, you're left with, the point that where Jens began, right? The reasons it's there are politics, the political economy, and the profit is real. Someone asked about banking. I mean, banks underwrite these corporations with loans because they are profitable. They don't do it out of charity. They do it because the banks and the financiers are also making a killing out of this. So there's lots of capital flooding into the sector because it is so lucrative. So political economy, that's a tough one. Political technology, it's working very well for all kinds of actors, in and around government. And in the book, we trace in some detail, like follow the money, how the money flows and which kinds of actors have an interest in this. And it turns out to be a lot of people have been incorporated into the nexus. So we also make a comparison with a colonial time where the cast of characters was somewhat fewer. Colonial corporations didn't have to pay off as many centers of power, district heads, and the current corporations complain that they are beset with demands for money from all sides, that they are in fact the targets of predation by officials and locals and villages and workers and everybody who wants them to pay. Because they've sunk their capital in the ground, they cannot leave, so they must pay. are we sorry for them? Well, you just have to say there's a lot of money circulating around the plantation, and it spreads fairly widely. Therefore, that makes it much harder to unsettle that set of interests. So
I think we have to stop there, Tania. We're sorry to interrupt you. And I mean, this is brilliant. I could go on, and there's so many other questions one could ask. But how does this relate to agrarian left populism, or does it not relate? And what does that then mean? What are the alternatives to this kind of economy? Is there any, etc., etc.? But I think for now we'll just have to wait for your book to come out and read your full argument there, and then continue the discussion afterwards. So thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure, and I think I speak on the whole audience that through their willingness to ask questions shows that this is really something they find interesting. And I wish we could all give you a loud applause, but alas, we have muted people. So, but I can at least give you mine. So thanks a lot. And now, let me also just say that our next Agrarian Seminar is Agrarian Change Seminar is in 2 weeks' time on the 18th. And there we have Lucilla Salvia from La Sapienza University of Rome, who will talk on labor contracting, gangmasters, and migrant labor in Italian agricultural commodity change. The case, so that is in 2 weeks' time. But for now, thanks, Tania, and thanks to everyone else. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.